Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance formed in 1949 to counter the Soviet Union. It started with 12 countries as members. Over the decades, it has had 8 rounds of expansion, and now NATO has 30 members. But the Soviet Union disintegrated more than 30 years ago. So why does NATO still exist? And why is it expanding? Russia has opposed this expansion. It believes NATO is encroaching on its area of political influence. The red line for Moscow was Ukraine joining the NATO. That's not happening. So to send a message, Putin launched a war on Ukraine. What he achieved seems to be the opposite of what he set out to achieve. Putin gave NATO a new lease of life, a new purpose, and a new excuse to expand. Soon the alliance will have 2 more members, Sweden and Finland. Their applications have been fast-tracked. Turkey was a roadblock, but that's been cleared. What did Turkey get in return? What does the NATO expansion mean for Putin? Will the war now spill beyond Ukraine? And what does a growing NATO mean for the world? On Gravitas tonight, we'll discuss that.
Значит, первое. Не должно быть транспортной системы на Украине. Не должно быть тоннеля под Карпатами. Не должно быть мостов через Днепр и так далее. Кстати говоря, не должно быть электричества. Вот замечательно. Банда, повторюсь, воров и убийц. Впереди у нас, как нам ликвидировать экономику Прибалтики, чтобы они успокоились и перестали нам, так сказать, досаждать.
Поэтому, когда НАТО собирается, чтобы сказать, что мы их враг, это вы. Это вы.
Cut off electricity to Ukraine, blow up bridges, destroy the economy of the Baltic, stop energy exports to the West. This is Russian television for you. Russian propaganda network. These commentators want Moscow to unleash its fury. What has made them so angry? NATO's expansion. 2 more countries are joining the NATO. The decks have been cleared, and this is a major political defeat for Vladimir Putin. His friend, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has turned. Turkey has dropped its objections to NATO expansion. Finland and Sweden are set to be part of this military alliance, and it's happening in record time. Putin attacked Ukraine to send a message to NATO. He wanted to stop its expansion. He's accelerated it. He's given NATO a new life and purpose. So Russian propagandists are crying war. They want an all-out attack. Will they get their wish? On Gravitas tonight, that's what we'll discuss. Yesterday's developments will go down in history books. Finland and Sweden have got their wish. They have been invited to join the NATO. They applied to join this military alliance in the month of May. We are still in June. Their appeal was held up by Turkey. You see, NATO has 30 member countries. Each one has a veto. So Finland and Sweden need a yes vote from each member to join the NATO. That is the rule. Their big hurdle was Turkey. Since day one, Turkey refused to back their bids. But yesterday, Recep Tayyip Erdogan dropped his objections.
In light of the progress we have made together, Turkey has agreed to support Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I want to thank President Erdogan, President Niinistö, and Prime Minister Andersson for the constructive spirit of today's talks.
So what changed there? Not too long ago, Turkey was dead set against NATO expansion. It accused Finland and Sweden of protecting militants. What made Erdogan change his mind? An offer he could not refuse. The NATO summit, is underway in Madrid. Yesterday, leaders of Finland and Sweden had a meeting with Erdogan on the sidelines. Also present was NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. This meeting lasted for 4 hours. There were intense negotiations and Erdogan walked away with a winning deal. Let's tell you what he got. Sweden and Finland had an arms embargo on Turkey. They will now lift it. They will also end support to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This group is also known as the PKK. Turkey sees them as terrorists. Even the US and the EU have designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. Finland and Sweden supported them. Now they will not. Then we come to the Gülenist movement. The groups led by Turkish preacher Fethullah Gülen. Erdogan blames him for an attempted coup back in 2016. Finland and Sweden have agreed to end their support to the Gülenists too. And that's not all. Turkey, Finland and Sweden will expand an anti-terrorism cooperation agreement. European nations will extradite terror suspects to Turkey. So Erdogan managed to tick all the boxes. Weapons, Kurds, Gülenists, terror suspects. He's had his way with everything. The Europeans have made significant concessions. The Finnish foreign minister said the deal was reached during a coffee break.
It was 4 hours meeting, of course, and very complicated in the beginning, and all parties repeated their own positions and how they see the situation. And then after 2 hours we felt that it's maybe not moving at all. And then we had a coffee break, and as always during the coffee break, great ideas come up, and then in the end, towards the end of the meeting, it was easier to come to the conclusion.
Sounds like each side got what they wanted. For Erdogan, this is not just a foreign policy win. It will also help him in domestic politics, and we'll tell you about it in a bit. For the moment, let's focus on what NATO got. NATO has 2 new allies in the fight against Russia, Finland and Sweden. They meet all the requirements. They're democracies, they're reliable partners, and most importantly, they add to NATO's firepower. Let me tell you how. Finland and Sweden together have more than 33,000 soldiers, plus more than 230,000 reserve troops. What about weapons? Finland and Sweden have more than 800 tanks, more than 200 combat aircraft, and 170 patrol and coastal vessels. Separately, Sweden has 5 submarines. There are other advantages too. Finnish and Swedish forces conduct drills with NATO troops. Most of their equipment is compatible with what NATO forces have. So there is interoperability too. Long story short, the stage is set for their entry into NATO, and it looks like a win-win deal for all sides. What happens next? Usually it takes a year for NATO to add new members, but the applications of Finland and Sweden will be fast-tracked. Their induction is expected soon. Both nations also work with European partners to counter Russian disinformation. They're being seen as perfect additions to the NATO family. It also makes them a clear threat to Russia. We're still waiting for an official response from the Kremlin, but in the past, Moscow has warned these 2 countries. The Russian government has said that they should prepare for retaliation. They should be prepared. Finland shares a 1,340-kilometer-long border with Russia. Sweden does not share a land border with Russia, but Moscow maintains a military presence in the Baltic Sea, so there is a threat of an attack by Russia. Moscow has threatened to deploy more troops to the Baltics. Russian leaders are making grave threats. Former President Dmitry Medvedev has spoken out. He says Russia will secure its borders with nuclear weapons. I have that statement with me. This is what he said. In the event of such an expansion of NATO, the length of its land borders with Russia will more than double. We will have to strengthen these borders. The Baltic region's non-nuclear status will become a thing of the past. The group of land and naval forces in the northern sector will be seriously increased. So the signals are clear. Russia is in no mood to forgive Finland and Sweden. What about Turkey? That's in our next story. Erdogan was Vladimir Putin's trump card against the NATO. Sort of like his inside man. But turns out the inside man was actually a double agent. Erdogan was never serious about blocking NATO expansion. He just put a price on it. He demanded political concessions, and NATO had no option but to accept them. It was a shrewd strategic move. Frankly, not expected from someone like Erdogan. This sort of brinkmanship is Putin's territory. In 2008, he did that by attacking Georgia. In 2014, he did it again by annexing Crimea. Both these moves were strategic masterstrokes. They kept the West guessing. But this time, Putin may have overdone it. The whole point of this war was to stop NATO expansion, to push NATO westward. Instead, the opposite is happening. Putin is getting 2 more NATO countries in his backyard, Finland and Sweden. So politically, the war is turning out to be a setback for him. Militarily, maybe not yet. Reports say Russia is winning the battle for the Donbass. They have captured Severodonetsk. Their next target is Lysychansk. But you can't measure wars with territory. You measure wars with political success. And on that, Putin has failed. Perhaps he was better off trying diplomacy or focusing on the Donbass instead of Kiev. Reminds me of a famous Sun Tzu quote. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. Clearly, this was not the time to fight. By January and February, the West was already under a lot of pressure. Putin had amassed thousands of soldiers near Ukraine. The threat of war was enough to spook them. Perhaps that was the time to negotiate, to drive home his military advantage. Instead, 4 months later, he's nowhere near taking Kiev. Now compare that to Erdogan. He knew exactly when not to fight. By the end of 2021, Erdogan was in the dumps. His economy was collapsing. His allies were abandoning him. Erdogan was the most toxic leader on the world stage. What's worse, his people were turning. Turkey is set to hold elections in 2023, presidential elections. And Erdogan's party is not polling well. So what does he do? He uses his foreign policy to boost his position. It was a delicate game of diplomatic chess. You could split it into 3 moves. The opening move. Erdogan declared neutrality when the war broke out. He did not condemn Putin's invasion. Instead, he placed himself as a mediator. He spoke to both Putin and Zelensky. His foreign minister visited both Kiev and Moscow. Plus, he hosted the first major peace talks between the two sides. You may remember that meeting in Antalya. Both Ukraine and Russia sent their foreign ministers. Other countries, of course, also tried to mediate. Israel tried. French President Emmanuel Macron tried. But none of them had Vladimir Putin's trust. Erdogan, on the other hand, did. They worked together in Syria, in the Caucasus, in North Africa. So Putin was more comfortable with Erdogan. The result is this. He had leverage on both sides. Suddenly, the US president was reaching out to him. The same president who once talked about toppling Erdogan. He was reaching out to him. Same with Moscow. They said nothing when Turkish drones killed dozens of Russian soldiers or when they closed off the Bosporus. Erdogan made himself indispensable for both sides. So politically, he was back in the game. Move number 2 was to raise money. He had to revive Turkey's economy to win the elections. And for that, he turned to the Gulf. And frankly, it was a no-brainer. The Gulf states were flush with cash after the rising oil prices. It was the best time to capitalize, and Erdogan did just that. In February, he visited the UAE. In March, he hosted Israel's president. In April, he visited Saudi Arabia. And in June, he hosted the Saudi crown prince. That's a lot of banquets and bilaterals, but they worked. Turkey has been welcomed back into the Islamic community. The Khashoggi murder is long forgotten. The Arab Spring is long forgotten. Erdogan is back on the high table. So that's politics check, economy check. Now, he just needed one more. A domestic political boost. Enter Finland and Sweden. Both countries are home to a sizable Kurdish community. Around 100,000 Kurds live in Sweden alone. But in Turkey, they're viewed as separatists. A rallying point for Erdogan's nationalist voters. So what does the president do? He blocks NATO's Nordic expansion. He demands concessions on extraditing the Kurds. So back home, he's now the nationalist hero, the man who brought terrorists to justice. Like I said, it was a delicate game of chess, a mix of desperation, luck, and statecraft. Maybe he's done enough to win the re-election in 2023. Maybe not. But here's what we can say in the meantime. Erdogan's victory would not have been possible without Western capitulation. Joe Biden promised to sanction Turkey. Instead, he's selling them F-16 jets. Finland and Sweden claim to be the happiest places in the world where you can find human rights in the tap water. But now they're extraditing Kurds. Yes, some of them may have committed crimes, but most of these Kurds were just fleeing persecution. They're activists and politicians. So Erdogan's grand strategic victory is a failure for the international community. They wanted to topple one warmongering autocrat, but in the process, they may be propping up another one. So you've seen the fall of a leader, but have you ever seen the fall of a city? Let's talk about Hong Kong. The city-state will soon be celebrating its 25th handover anniversary. Preparations are on in full swing. Chinese President Xi Jinping will be attending the celebrations, also the inauguration of Hong Kong's new government, one that will be led by Chief Executive John Lee. But what John Lee will be taking charge of is not Hong Kong. He's taking charge of what remains of the once glorious city-state. In the last 2 years, Xi Jinping has reduced Hong Kong to rubble. He has thrown one country, two systems out of the window, and with the fall of this framework, Hong Kong too has fallen. Hong Kong is no longer a global business hub. It no longer attracts expats. The cosmopolitan culture is dying and tourism is restricted. This is the Hong Kong Jumbo. The floating restaurant used to be one of the city's iconic structures. It sank in the weeks leading up to the Silver Jubilee celebrations, perfectly symbolizing the state of affairs. Hong Kong in 2022 was not supposed to look like this. Let's go back to the year 2019. Hong Kong was a global business hub, a gateway to Southeast Asia, bustling city, home to 7.4 million people, home to diverse ethnicities, nationalities. Expats made at least 10% of the city's population. Hong Kong was a poster child of free trade and open market. The city was home to more than 9,000 international firms, the world's most premium properties, world-class schools. What happened then? In 2019, Hong Kongers came together to demand democracy. Xi Jinping decided to serve them just the opposite. Beijing began tightening its grip on Hong Kong. In 2020 came the Hong Kong security law. It hammered the city's spirit. It reduced the city's autonomy. The law impacted freedom, free speech, free press, and also the lives of foreigners. The city began looking at them with suspicion. In 2021 came Xi Jinping's obsession with zero COVID. Hong Kong was shut off from the world, slapped with stringent lockdowns. Businesses suffered and so did people. When Hong Kong began separating COVID-infected children from their parents, it was the final straw, the final nail in the coffin for many citizens. They began leaving. 23,000 people left Hong Kong in 2021, 93,000 in 2020. Half of European businesses are considering leaving the city. A survey of US companies found that 30% had delayed investment and 25% are considering leaving Hong Kong. Many prominent companies have already left. The list includes VF Corporation, that's the parent company of the North Face, Timberland, Vans, etc., also Vanguard. Today, Hong Kong's cosmopolitan culture is dying. 157,000 people moved out of the city in the first 3 months of this year. Many of them were expats. More than 23,000 moved out in the month of May. Among them were engineers, IT professionals, also investment bankers. The banking sector has long been Hong Kong's blue-eyed boy, but in the last 2 years, top talent from HSBC, Credit Suisse, Citi and Deutsche Bank have either transferred themselves to other countries or have left their Hong Kong-based jobs. To avoid losing talent, JP Morgan moved several managing directors out of Hong Kong. Today, Hong Kong's brain drain is visible in the city's schools. At least 30,000 students quit between October 2020 and September 2021. At least 4,050 teachers have resigned their jobs in the last academic year. Where are all these people going? Singapore has been a major beneficiary. Schools there have seen an influx of students coming from Hong Kong. The families moving are selling their houses at lower prices. So prices of pre-owned homes in Hong Kong are down at least 7%. Today, people aren't chasing Hong Kong-based jobs anymore. Visa applications have fallen by at least a third. The Hong Kong port, which was once the busiest container port in the world, is now number 8 on the chart. Neighbors Singapore and South Korea have overtaken the city. Hong Kong in 2022 is unrecognizable. It has been completely hijacked by China. Chinese companies make up 80% of the market capitalization in Hong Kong stock market. In 1997, it was just 16%. If you account for the top 10 holdings of the benchmark Hang Seng Index, you would see that 7 are Chinese firms. When Hong Kong was handed over to China 25 years ago, Beijing promised the city-state could keep its capitalist system for 50 years. But in the last 2 years, Beijing has destroyed foreign businesses and cynicized Hong Kong. The one shining star of Asia is now closing itself to the world. Hong Kong is becoming inaccessible, unlivable, and this is a gift of Xi Jinping. The world knows him as an authoritarian leader. World leaders are convinced democracy has been dismantled in Hong Kong. The Communist Party faces no challenge. China will remain a one-party state for the foreseeable future. But Xi Jinping does not like this description. So he has come up with a new way to describe China. You won't believe this. Xi Jinping says China is a democracy. And the Chinese president has conducted a poll, he says, to prove that. What is all this about? Our next report tells you about China's latest farce.
The Chinese state loves to spin a lot of stories, but this one was the mother of all spins. 5 years back, China called itself a democracy, one that believes in the rule of law. It didn't stop there. Last year, Beijing published a white paper. It declared that China was a democracy that works. This year, Xi Jinping is taking this narrative a step further. Last Sunday, the Chinese president made an announcement. He claimed Beijing conducted a poll among millions of Chinese citizens. What for? Xi Jinping said the aim was to gather people's thoughts about China's future leadership. What the senior leadership should look like. The Chinese president has even coined a term for this initiative. He is calling it a whole process democracy. Xi Jinping's claims are just a facade. There were no elections in China. What the Chinese president is talking about was an online poll, and that's not the same as an election. The Communist Party ran this poll on several platforms recently. How many Chinese citizens participated in it? Just over 8 million out of a population of 1.4 billion. No one knows the identities of these voters. The exercise was actually a publicity stunt. Later this year, all members of the Communist Party will gather in Beijing. They'll participate in the party congress. It happens every 5 years. During the event, Communist Party leaders vote to pick the new Chinese leadership. But there is hardly anything democratic about these elections. The polls are managed. Votes are fixed before the election. Just look at how the last 2 elections panned out for Xi Jinping. He was elected president for the first time in 2013. 2,952 votes were cast in Xi Jinping's favor. 3 members abstained, and just 1 dared to oppose Xi Jinping. The next election in 2018 was a clean sweep. All 2,970 votes were cast in favor of Xi Jinping. Many expect this year's election to be no different. Xi Jinping is guaranteed a historic 3rd term as China's president. But he is expected to pick a different team. With no obvious challenges in sight, the election is expected to serve as a reminder. Xi Jinping still reigns supreme in China.
Our next story is from Sri Lanka. The crisis is getting worse by the day. They're out of fuel now. Colombo's reserves have hit rock bottom. Supplies are running out. This is what's left. 1,100 tons of petrol, 7,500 tons of diesel. This may sound like a lot, but it's not sufficient even for a day. To make things worse, no fresh fuel shipments are expected. Sri Lanka has defaulted on payments. It has failed to give guarantees to lenders, so no new fuel vessels are coming to Sri Lanka. Colombo will have to manage with what it has left. How will they do it? by suspending sales. Sri Lanka has suspended the sale of fuel. It has banned fuel for everyone and everything except for essential services like trains, buses, ambulances, food vehicles, etc. This is what it means. If you own a private vehicle, you will not be able to refuel it. If you have to travel somewhere, you have to use public transport. If you're unwell and require medical help, you will have to wait for an ambulance to pick you up. How long will this ban last? 2 weeks, but there's no guarantee it will end after that. Like I said, no new fuel shipments are in sight. What is Sri Lanka doing to secure new supplies? It is reaching out to foreign companies, private suppliers that can help it restock. Let me show you this post from Kanchana Vijayasekara. He is the Minister of Power and Energy. He says companies from oil exporting nations will now be allowed to import fuel to Sri Lanka. In other words, the fuel market is now open to private players. They will be allowed to operate and distribute fuel on the island. So far, only 2 companies could do this: the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and the Lanka Indian Oil Company, a subsidiary of the Indian Oil Corporation. Until now, only these 2 companies had retail stations in Sri Lanka. Going forward, the market will be open to all. But will Sri Lanka find takers for this plan? And I'll tell you why I asked this. Last month, they tried something similar. Sri Lanka opened fuel imports to 6 private companies. The plan failed to take off. Will this time be different? So far, only 2 private companies have shown interest, and even these are yet to seal a deal. For the Lankan government, time is running out. Public anger is boiling over. The protests seem to have spread to every segment of society. Government workers, teachers, medical staff, lawyers, they're all out on the streets protesting the shutdown.
There is a serious breakdown in the health service. If we don't get fuel, the healthcare service will collapse completely. We know by now that agriculture has collapsed. The education system has collapsed. The healthcare service has collapsed by 90%.
Healthcare workers have no way to report to work, nowhere to get fuel. Almost all vehicles in the country are parked along roads, near petrol stations. Patients don't have transport to come to hospital. Patients are dying while on the way to hospital. This country, these people were pushed here by this corrupt government.
It's a tragic state of affairs. First, there was not enough food. Then medicine supplies ran out. Now people can't even buy fuel. So it comes as no surprise that many of them are trying to leave. Look at these images. They're from Monday. What you see are Sri Lankans being apprehended from a boat, at least 47 of them in this case. They were trying to flee the country. The Lankan Navy caught them. And this is not an isolated incident. In the last 2 weeks, close to 500 people have been stopped from trying to leave Sri Lanka in small fishing boats. Where were they trying to go? Reports say a lot of these boats were bound for Australia. Some of them even made it to the Australian waters, but they were all turned back. What happens to those who return? They end up in jail. And you know what? Most of these detainees are not poor laborers. They're educated, well-off Sri Lankans, people who sold their belongings to start a new life and now seem to have no means to survive. This is what it has come down to. The crisis has not spared anyone, from the poor to the middle class to the rich and elite. They're all suffering in Sri Lanka as the political class escapes accountability. Sri Lanka's is not a fuel or a financial crisis. It is now a humanitarian crisis. And Sri Lanka may be the worst hit, but they're not alone. Most Asian countries are reeling from an energy crisis. India, Bangladesh, China, Pakistan, Japan, all of them are reporting energy shortages. But why now? Because of 2 very familiar reasons: the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Let's talk about the first one. 2020 and 2021 were lockdown years in most parts of the world. Most Asian countries shut their economies to keep the virus out. Factories were closed, roads were empty. So energy demand fell considerably, by almost 3% in the first quarter of 2020. But this year, Asia is recovering. As economies reopen, they will need more energy to run factories, to power offices. Just one problem though: the supply has not been able to keep up as energy prices keep rising. And that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is the war in Ukraine. Russia is the 3rd largest oil producer in the world, also the 2nd largest crude exporter. If Russia is at war, supply will be affected. So now you know why energy prices are climbing. Next question: Why is this so hard on Asia? Why is Asia being hit so hard? Well, this data should give you an idea. These are the largest net crude importers in the world. China is number 1, India is number 2, South Korea at number 3, the US is at number 4, and Japan is number 5. So 4 out of the top 5 are Asian economies. Why is that? A, because they have a higher population, and B, because their industrial needs are higher. Before the pandemic, this was not an issue. Asian countries could manage their energy payments. But now that's not the case. Coal prices are 5 times higher than 2021. Natural gas prices are 10 times higher. So Asia is paying more money for the same energy shipments. And even then, there's a big caveat. You see, many Asian economies rely heavily on LNG, liquefied natural gas, LNG. But most of the LNG is now being bought by Europe. They are not getting enough piped gas, so they're buying liquefied version instead. The result is this: Asian economies are not getting enough energy. India's LNG imports are down 14%. China's LNG imports are down 22%. This shortage has real-world impacts. Pakistan is reporting 12-hour-long power cuts. Chinese provinces are scaling back electricity use. Their gas-based power output is down 19%. India too has been affected. This is India's worst power crisis in 6 years. The average power cuts last between 2 to 8 hours. Even Japan is bracing for cuts. Their government is asking people to reduce consumption or face power cuts. And remember when this is happening: in the middle of an intense heat wave. In Japan, temperatures have broken 150-year-old records. Without power, it is impossible to survive this weather. So what do governments do? They can't get natural gas. Green energy is taking too long. So most countries are reverting to coal. India produces 75% of its power from coal, but coal inventories are at their lowest in 9 years. So what is India doing? Importing more coal. Australia is also asking power plants to increase their coal stock. China's coal output is up 11%. And in Europe, Germany, Austria and the Netherlands are restarting coal plants. Do you see the problem here? Countries are turning back the clock to tackle the power crisis. They're returning to coal. And this presents a long-term challenge. Coal is the most polluting fossil fuel in the world. It is the single largest contributor to climate change. If we keep using coal, we are accelerating climate change. We are burning through our small carbon budget. What does that mean? It means we could breach our climate targets. Global warming could exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that is irreversible. You cannot redo climate action. Once temperatures breach that threshold, the changes are permanent. You cannot reverse them. So what's the solution here? How do you balance power requirements with climate action? For starters, end this pointless war. As long as the war drags on, energy prices will remain high, supply chains will be distressed, countries will have to drain their reserves to keep the lights on. Secondly, do not sacrifice on climate goals. Energy shortage cannot be an excuse to pollute. Europe should understand this. They're scooping up natural gas by paying higher prices than Asia. At the same time, they're restarting coal plants. And the worst part, when Asia buys discounted Russian energy, they give lectures. And finally, maybe it's time to rein in big oil. This year, oil and gas companies are expected to make $834 billion in profits. $834 billion. Guess what they made last year? Just $493 billion. So energy profits are up more than 70%. But the common man continues to suffer with power cuts, with inflation, and with fuel costs. To solve this energy crunch, we need joint action. We need the oil cartels, we need the governments, and we need the oil executives to all work together. If not, this crisis could upend our economy and our planet. And what a nightmare that would be, a recession in darkness. Right now, our economy is heading that way. None of the economic indicators look good. None of the agencies have a good forecast, and none of the investors have anything good to say. We'll start with the markets. It's the easiest way to gauge the economic mood, and once again, it's not good news. In America, Dow Jones fell nearly 1.6%, Nasdaq dropped 3%, Japan's Nikkei closed 1% down, European stocks lost 0.7%, in India, the Nifty closed around 0.3% down. Those numbers may not seem as worrying as before, but look at the overall picture. This is the worst performance by emerging stocks in 24 years. They fell 20% during the 1998 Asian financial crisis. This year, they're down 17%. 17% in just about 6 months. And the reason is quite clear. Inflation worries. The US Federal Reserve is consistently hiking interest rates to tame inflation. They could do it again in the month of July. Experts are predicting another 75 basis point hike. And this is bad news for India. The Reserve Bank of India is going to come up with its next policy announcement in August, not in July. They too are expected to hike interests. But the move will come 1 month later. The result? More pressure on the Indian rupee. It is already sliding towards new records. Today, the rupee briefly slid below 79 against the US dollar. Imagine that. $1 now equals almost 79 rupees. To give you some context, it was 73 rupees in mid-January this year. Experts say this could become the new normal. The dollar could breach 80 or 81. What does that mean for you, the consumer? More inflationary pain. If the rupee loses value, imports become more expensive. You're paying more money for the same goods. That's what we call imported inflation. And right now, India is heading in that direction. The RBI says inflation will remain above 6% until December. And that is the best case scenario, by the way. Because India's inflation is at 7.79%. Bringing it down to 6% will be a tough job, especially with the rising dollar. A lot depends on what happens in the Western markets, in the US and in Europe. Both economies are dangerously close to a recession. Earlier today, the US revised its economic data for the first quarter of 2022. The first estimate showed a GDP contraction of 1.4%. The revised data says 1.6%. Compare that to the last quarter of 2021. The US economy grew 6.9%. Do you see the gap here? From 6.9% growth to 1.6% contraction. And remember, this was before the interest hikes. So at this rate, a recession looks inevitable. Listen to this assessment by the IMF chief.
We expect the US economy will slow. We are conscious that there is a narrowing path to avoiding a recession in the US. We also have to recognize the uncertainty of the current situation. The economy continues to recover from the pandemic, and important shocks are buffering the economy from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and from lockdowns in China. In other words, there is a lot that is exogenous but is impacting the US.
Narrowing path to avoiding a recession. That's what the IMF is saying, and the same applies to Europe. Morgan Stanley has published a new forecast for the Eurozone. They are projecting a recession by the end of 2022. Two reasons for that. A, the risk of Russia cutting off gas supplies, and B, falling business morale. In other words, investors are being put off by inflation. So that's two major economies at risk of recession, the United States and Europe. If they slip into recession, the whole world will follow. And do you know the worst part? All of this is being predicted in real time. Every bank is warning of a recession. Every economist is calling for proactive measures, but governments are still not getting a handle on it. They're still stuck in the policies of the 1950s, letting central banks control inflation, as if they have no power to help the people. The solution to this crisis is not just economic, it must be political. This is the time for creative policy making to work in tandem with the central banks. Because right now we are in the middle of a slow motion train crash. We can see what's happening. We can see the impending disaster. But we seem to be helpless to stop it. Speaking of disasters, our next story is about Donald Trump. Democrats' worst nightmare. He's out of power. And if the Democrats have their way, he may never really return. They're probing him for what happened on the 6th of January, the storming of the Capitol Hill. They're trying to establish his role in the insurrection. 5 hearings have concluded. The last one has gone viral. It's the testimony of a former White House staffer. She's made some sensational claims. They revolve around planned rioting, letting armed supporters into the Capitol, and Trump's refusal to stop the carnage. How will these so-called revelations impact Donald Trump's political future? Our next report tells you. He may be out of office, but he's still in the news. The American press can't get enough of him. The Democrats won't let go of him. Such is Donald Trump's legacy. A figure unlike any other in American history. He defied norms, upended traditions, even incited an insurrection. He could soon be made to face the consequences. Courtesy the January 6th committee. This is what happened on January 6, 2021. American democracy was attacked. Now there's an investigation into the storming of Capitol Hill. It was launched on the 12th of June to hold Captain Chaos accountable, to establish his role in the uprising. This probe is being led by Democrats with just 2 Republican members. They're collecting evidence, conducting interviews, recording testimonies, all in a bid to corner Trump. The latest testimony has triggered quite a storm. It's of Cassidy Hutchinson, a former aide to Mark Meadows, America's former chief of staff. 25-year-old Hutchinson has made some stunning claims. She says Trump roped in electoral rioters on the night of January 5th and apparently asked them to allow armed supporters into his rally.
I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
She's further claimed that Trump was so desperate to get to the Capitol that he had a physical altercation with an official who refused to take him.
The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol." Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Renato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
Hutchinson also claims that Trump refused to act despite his own daughter requesting him to do so.
I remember her saying at various points, she wanted her dad to send them home. She wanted her dad to tell them to go home peacefully, and she wanted to include language that he necessarily wasn't on board with at the time.
This testimony is going viral. It has ignited serious interest in the probe. Millions of Americans have started tuning in. Trump is mighty upset.
They're getting into the Capitol tonight.
On Monday evening, he unleashed a frenzy of posts on his social media app, Truth Social. He says he hardly knows Hutchinson. He's calling her a total phony, a leaker, disgraceful. He says her body language is that of a bull and her handwriting that of a wacko. Classic Donald Trump insults, but they don't help his cause. Trump says he does not know her, but photos circulating on Twitter show Hutchinson on board Air Force One with the former president. This is evidence that could land him in more trouble.
Thank you very much.
Because reports say the next hearing of the committee is expected to be even more sensational.
On the penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give.
Megacities are falling, economies are falling, stocks are falling, currencies are falling. It's no wonder our world today is sadder than it's ever been. And I'm not making this sweeping assumption. I'm simply referring to the latest Gallup survey. It has found that the world is unhappier and more stressed than ever before. How did Gallup conclude this? By speaking to adults in 122 countries and asking them about their experiences. 42% of adults said that they were worried, 41% were stressed, 31% were hurting physically, 28% were sad, and 23% were angry. People were also asked about their positive feelings. What did they say? Fewer people said they felt well rested or had experienced a lot of enjoyment or reported smiling or laughing a lot. Fewer people said that they were treated with respect, and only 15% of adults said they did something interesting the day before this interview. Some number crunching and calculation later, Gallup concluded that people are living with uncertainty. Their negative experiences are on the rise, positive experiences are falling. Now, why do you think that's happening? Why are people more stressed and unhappy than ever? Is it because of the Wuhan virus? Well, that's one big factor, yes, but the pandemic hit us in 2020 and the world was relatively positive then. In 2021, the positivity index dropped for the first time in 4 years. So what happened last year? Honestly, it's hard to tell. Could be the prolonged pandemic, could be because more people lost their loved ones in 2021 than 2020 in some parts of the world. Could also be because of what was happening around the world geopolitically. In Myanmar, for example, there was a coup. Israel and Hamas went into an 11-day war. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regained power. Today, Afghanistan is the least positive country in the world. The percentage of Afghans who reported enjoying, smiling or being well rested has dropped to a record low. No surprises there. You see, everything that happens in this world affects how we feel. Whether it's being separated from your child during a lockdown, or struggling to find a job during a pandemic, or trying to pursue your dreams during political conflict, everything impacts your emotions. And these emotions go a long way in affecting your output, your life's outcome, society's mental health, even its progress. My point is, when I say our world today is sadder than it has ever been, it's not something that you can brush aside anymore or dismiss as a first world problem. Unhappy surroundings affect everyone, everywhere in the world. How can we undo that? Can governments and policymakers tackle unhappiness? Well, some have tried. In 2008, Bhutan came up with an idea. It established a Ministry of Happiness. The idea was to measure people's happiness, calculate their well-being, and use that data to frame policies. In 2013, Venezuela followed suit. In 2016, the United Arab Emirates. Today, none of them feature on the list of the happiest countries in the world. You could say in most countries, the Happiness Ministry has been a failed experiment. So what is the secret to ensuring happiness? How can countries make people stress-free? Finland may have some answers. It has been crowned the happiest country for 5 years in a row. Do you know what worked in Finland's favor? Simple things. Clean air, crystal clear lakes, a warm culture, low crime rates, prioritizing cooperation over competition, a good education system, universal health care, equal opportunity. Even something as basic as 50-day plus paternal leave. In Finland, a parent is allowed to stay at home till the child is 3 years old, and that too without losing his or her job. Little things like these make people less stressed. And you don't need a happiness ministry to tell you that. Today, uncertainty is at its peak. People don't know whether they will have a job tomorrow, whether they'll be able to feed their family or pay a medical bill. They don't know whether their child is safe at school, if their daughter is safe on the streets, if their elderly parent will get a bed in hospital. It may not be easy for governments to stop wars or coups or the rising energy prices. But ensuring basics like clean air, health care, security during times like these can go a long way. It can make the world a less unhappier place. We're wrapping the show, leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.
Обрезала, и здесь, покажи здесь дырку. Вообще просто четкая. Вот отсюда. Нет. Ну вот как она это четко вырезана.